Hi team, I wanted to make a bite-sized video specifically looking at terrain rules because at first glance it seems a little bit complicated, but once you boil it down, it's really not. Right, the terrain rules cover 6 pages in the main rule book, but 2 of those pages are just examples, so really the terrain only covers 4 pages. And terrain is largely the same as it was in 8th edition, but there are some additions this time. So as well as +1 armor when you get shot at, you can get +1 armor in close combat. There's also rules for dense terrain, so it's -1 to hit something, which seems a bit funny at first because you think about 8th edition when you get a -1 to hit, and then another -1 to hit, and then a third -1 to hit, and suddenly you can't hit anything. But in 9th edition, remember, dice rolls can only be modified up or down and no more than 1. So -1 to hit isn't that significant because it doesn't compound with other -1s to hit. There's also a rule for obscuring terrain, which means you can't shoot through stuff. And there's rules for defensible terrain, which means if you attack a unit in a terrain item, they can fire Overwatch on a 5+, or they can get +1 to hit back in close combat. Those are the main changes that affect the terrain rules, the main changes that affect terrain rules in 9th edition. So first up, they categorize terrain in 4 different ways: hills, obstacles, area terrain, and buildings. However, hills and buildings don't really count. Hills are considered to be part of the battlefield rather than a terrain feature. They don't have any rules and you don't get any benefits if you stand on them. All they really do is block line of sight. And buildings are considered to be units rather than terrain features. Each building has a data sheet and unless otherwise noted is either friendly or enemy, so you can't move across them, unless of course you're saying that this thing is not friendly or enemy, and then you can happily put all your units on them. So that just leaves obstacles and area terrain. Now the first thing you do is agree with your opponent what the rules are for your obstacles and area terrain before the battle begins. If you're playing competitive 40k at a tournament or something, I'm sure the tournament organisers would have already ruled what rules apply to the obstacles and area terrain that you're going to be using during your fighting, during your game. If you're playing with your opponent, however, what you'll do is you'll say, right, before the battle begins, these ones over here have these rules and these ones over here have these rules. And most of the rules are relatively the same as before, with some new ones, with some exceptions. So there's 11 rules, or 11 terrain traits that you can apply. So what I'm going to do is go through them all individually with some examples. And then I'm going to show you some ruins, some woods, some obstacles, and talk about the differences between 8th and 9th edition in a bit more detail, which boils it down a bit and makes the terrain rules section, the terrain traits section, a little bit less scary. Before we do, let's talk about the footprint for area terrain, which to my mind hasn't changed from any previous editions. But in 9th edition, what they've done is clarified it. So if there's any rules debates out there, you know exactly what they mean by the footprint for a piece of area terrain. A footprint is the boundary level at ground level, and it's usually determined by a base. Not everything has a base, however, so if not, then agree with your opponent what the footprint is. And in the case of all previous editions, most people said this, and there were rules in previous editions that most people said this. So if your unit is in there, a model is in there, you can say that that model is in that piece of area terrain, but agree with your opponent beforehand. Right, the 11 terrain traits. Let's go through them in order, and let's start with defensible. Defensible applies to only to infantry units if they are on or in an area terrain feature with a defensible trait. And remember, on or in, we talked about the footprint for area terrain. Then they can gain a benefit when an enemy unit declares a charge against that unit on or in an area terrain. If you were to draw a straight line 1 millimeter in thickness between the closest parts of the bases or holes between the 2 closest models, then you gain either hold steady or set to defend. So you charge a unit, the unit in area terrain says I'm holding steady, or I am setting to defend in the charge phase. Hold steady means you can fire Overwatch on a 5+. Set to defend means the defending unit in the area terrain gets +1 to hit. So quite simple really, +1 to hit with Overwatch or +1 to hit in the fight phase. Let's set up an example. This terrain feature, determined by the footprint, is defensible. If I'm charging the Plague Marines with the Space Marines here, I will not get the benefit of the defensible rule because the closest two models will not pass over that terrain feature. If I'm charging this way, however, that unit can gain the benefit of the defensible keyword because this terrain feature is defensible and every infantry model in this unit is within 3 inches of an obstacle or terrain feature with this trait, and the closest point between the two units will pass over that terrain feature. So it's important to note here that you don't have to be wholly within the terrain feature, you just need to be an infantry unit and within 3 inches of it. And so when these guys declare a charge in, if that's got the defensible keyword, I can say that these get +1 to hit in Overwatch, hitting on a 5+, or +1 to hit in the fight phase by either holding steady or setting to defend. Here are the examples they give using GW miniatures, and here's 2 examples of area terrain that they say are defensible: woods and ruins. They also give a couple of examples of obstacles being defensible as well, such as fuel pipes, barricades, and ruined walls. The next terrain trait is defense line. If an enemy unit is within 1 inch of this terrain feature, you can still make a charge move against it, so long as the charging unit ends its charge move touching that terrain feature and within 2 inches of the enemy unit. So normally to get an engagement range and get in close combat, you need to be within 1 inch. But in this case, you just need to be within 2 inches, so long as you're touching that defense line. This is the same thing that we saw in 8th edition. This isn't really a change. They give 0 examples of area terrain gaining the defense line rules. It makes sense really. Obstacles gain the defense line rules, such as fuel pipes, barricades, and walls. So I'm charging my Plague Marines. I can't actually get within 1 inch of these guys, they'll fall off. But so long as I touch that terrain feature, I can engage an enemy unit which is up to 2 inches away. Okay, third terrain trait, Breachable, applies to infantry, beasts or swarm models. They can move through walls, girders, change, foliage without impediment, basically as if it wasn't there. Again, really no change from previous editions. You have some walls or you have some ruins. You can simply move through them as if they weren't there. This model doesn't have to go all the way around. It can go straight through. It can go straight through so long as it's an infantry, beast or swarm. Next up, difficult ground. Unless you have the fly keyword, all models subtract 2 when making a normal move, advance, fallback or charge move over this terrain feature. It doesn't matter whether you're Titanic or not. It's -2 to charge, -2 to move, -2 to advance, unless there's a rule in your datasheet that says you ignore the difficult ground rule. -2 movement. In 8th edition that only applied to craters, but in 9th edition they give examples again of fuel pipes, barricades on walls, and area terrain such as woods. They don't include ruins in their examples, so as far as Games Workshop are concerned, these aren't difficult ground, these aren't -2 to move through, but these are. But it's up to you. Agree with your opponent before the game begins. What counts as difficult ground? All of it? None of it? -2 every time you move, charge, fall back will slow down the battle quite considerably. Maybe you just want to say, well, it's just craters. We're used to using craters as that way. We're going to continue to use craters as that way and ignore the -2 to this other stuff. Next up, we have dense cover. The dense cover rules give you -1 to hit something if you're firing at something in it or through it. But if you're in it and firing out of it, wholly within the terrain feature, you don't suffer the -1 to hit penalty. To get the -1 to hit or to suffer the -1 to hit, then the terrain feature must be at least 3 inches high, and you must be able to draw a straight line to every single part of the model's base or hull. Aircraft don't suffer this, don't gain the benefit, no penalty, sorry, for shooting aircraft that are even partially obscured, or units with a wounds characteristics of 18+ or more wounds. So big stuff and stuff flying behind this area terrain at least 3 inches high, which has the dense cover rule, there's no -1 to hit them. The examples they give are woods and ruined walls, not ruins itself. They say that these things can count as dense cover. So I'm not going to suffer the -1 to hit these Plague Marines if I fire from this angle. Yes, this terrain feature is at least 3 inches tall, but for the dense cover rule to kick in, you need to draw straight lines to every model without passing through any part of the terrain feature with this trait. So shooting this way, it wouldn't be -1 to hit them. Shooting that way, it would be -1 to hit them. Again, if you're completely behind dense cover, then it's going to be -1 to hit these Plague Marines. But if they're shooting this way towards us, then they'll also suffer the -1 to hit because they'll be firing through dense cover. Unless they're firing at an Imperial Knight, it won't be -1 to hit this thing. It's got 18 plus wounds, but the Knight does suffer the -1 to hit shooting at the Plague Marines. They also consider ruined walls to be dense cover as well. So these Plague Marines, -1 to hit from the Knight's point of view, but not the other way around. Next one is unstable position. The models cannot be set up or end their move on top of this terrain feature. This one's very simple. The examples they give for the unstable position rules are those terrain features that you can't balance a model on top of anyway. They just say, here's a straight rule for it. So an Imperial statue, a wall itself, you can't purchase, you can't stick a model on top of a bit of wall without it falling off. Barricades and fuel pipes. If you can't stick a model there, they give it the unstable position rule, saying you can't stick a model there. So unstable position, very straightforward, you can't be placed on it. Another very straightforward one is exposed position. You don't get any benefits for exposed position terrain things while you're on it, but you can get benefits of cover if you're behind it. So items of battlefield debris are exposed positions. You don't get any benefits if you're on them. Battlefield debris doesn't have any other keywords either, so you don't get any benefit if you're behind them, but armoured containers do. So exposed position, if you're on them, no benefits whatsoever. If you're behind them, then you get the benefits of the other keywords associated with armoured containers. That's scalable and light position, light cover. Light cover, we'll get to that. Next up, we have the obscuring trait. Models that are on or within this terrain feature can be seen and targeted normally. But if this terrain feature is at least 5 inches in height, then models cannot see through or over this terrain feature. And the item that they give for obscuring terrain features is ruins, which means if you're in it, fine, the obscuring rule doesn't kick in. Models that are on or within doesn't kick in. If you're behind it, then obscuring does kick in. And if you're behind it, you cannot be targeted, you cannot be seen unless you're an aircraft or unless you've got 18 plus wounds. So the ruins are obscuring. Models on or within the terrain feature can be seen and targeted normally. Models behind it can't be seen or targeted unless there's an aircraft here or unless it's an Imperial Knight. This terrain feature is more than at least 5 inches in height, and we can see the base, the area terrain, its footprint. The Plague Marines can target the Knight. The Knight can't target the Plague Marines. So in 9th edition Warhammer 40k, ruins that are at least 5 inches in height block line of sight, completely block line of sight on the ground floor, on every floor. Plague Marines can't shoot the Hellblasters, Hellblasters can't shoot the Plague Marines. You need to have an aircraft behind there and then it can get shot at. You need to have an Imperial Knight behind there and then it can get shot at. If one model is not visible to the other without drawing a straight line going through the terrain feature, then the obscuring rule kicks in. If they're stuck out on the edge like this, however, the obscuring rule would not kick in. So ruins completely stop people shooting through them, but not into them unless they're big. Light cover, this is the rule that we all know, which is +1 to saving throws against ranged weapons. When an attack made with a ranged weapon wounds a model that's receiving the benefits of cover from this terrain feature, add 1 to the saving throw. So ruins, craters, armoured containers, barricades and fuel pipes are all considered to be light cover. That's the same as it was before, +1 to your saving throws for range attacks. Woods and ruined walls are considered to be dense cover, as discussed earlier, which is -1 to hit. Interestingly enough, they don't give woods and ruined walls the light cover keyword either. It's just -1 to hit them, but not +1 to their armor save from ranged attacks. We also have heavy cover, which is +1 to saving throws for melee weapons. This doesn't benefit the model that made a charge this turn. So if you charge into a squad that is getting the benefit of heavy cover, and you've suddenly charged into that terrain feature that has the heavy cover trait, because you've charged, you don't get the +1 to your armor saving throws. You're charging, you get to smack them up first, they get +1 to their armor saving throws, but you don't when they get to hit you back again. The only example of heavy cover they give is fuel pipes and barricades, but not ruined walls. These things are light cover and heavy cover. So if you're behind them, it's +1 to your armor save when you shoot at them. And if you charge them, +1 to their armor save while they're within gaining the benefit of that terrain feature. Therefore, barricades and fuel pipes are going to be one of the best terrain features to hunker down in 9th edition 40k if you apply all these traits to your barricades and fuel pipes. 2 more to go. Scalable and inspiring. Scalable is basically the same as breachable. Breachable was for infantry beasts and swarms moving through walls, and scalable means infantry beasts and swarms can climb up them. Nothing can get to the top floor. You can go through ceilings, you can go through water, things like that if it's scalable, and nothing can get to the top floor unless it's an infantry beast or swarm and models that can fly. Again, this is not a change. This is something we saw in 8th edition. It's just wrapped up and made more clear. And then inspiring, +1 to your leadership if you're wholly within 6 inches of something that has the inspiring keyword, such as imperial statues. Again, not a change. You've got to share the keyword for that inspiring piece of terrain. It could be a statue of Gork or Mork and you give it the Orc keyword. It could be a webway gate and you give it the Eldari keyword. But you've got to share the keyword. If you're wholly within 6 inches, you get +1 to your leadership. So those are the 11 terrain traits. It seems a bit complicated, but let's have a look at some very specific pieces of terrain that we use most commonly and how it will affect 9th edition 40k. Hills, you don't get any benefits. Easy. Here's another common one, obstacles. You don't get any benefits. It's all optional though. Of course, if you set up your terrain like this, then before the battle begins, you and your opponent might agree that if you set up a unit within an inch of that from the point of view of the firer, then that unit counts as having light cover. Ruins. Ruins have a footprint determined by their base, or in the cases of things like that, you might decide that the footprint of that ruin goes across there as well. And ruins are scalable, breachable, light cover, defensible, obscuring. It sounds like a lot, but scalable and breachable are the same as in 8th edition. Basically, infantry units, beasts and swarms can move through them because they're breachable and scalable. They can go up and down them, and only stuff with a fly keyword can land on top of them. Those 2 things, done, easy. They're also light cover. If you're wholly within them from the point of view of the firer, then you're going to get a +1 to your armor save when you shoot at them. The 2 really new ones are defensible and obscuring. Defensible are if you charge a squad, if you charge something that is in a ruin, they're going to get +1 to hit you in Overwatch or +1 to hit you with it in the fight phase. And you can choose that when the enemy declares a charge against you. And obscuring, that's the big one. If you're behind it, it completely blocks off line of sight unless you're an aircraft or something with a wounds characteristics of 18 or more. Essentially, ruins are not changing. The rules for them are not changing except for that +1 to hit when you charge stuff and the fact that they block off line of sight. So ruins aren't going to be that difficult to remember, but it's going to feel a bit weird at first. These 2 tanks just can't shoot at each other. They can't fire through that obscuring piece of terrain. It will make firing lanes much more valuable. Assault armies much more potent if you're playing with ruined terrain. Woods. I often do things like this to represent my wooded areas. They're dense cover, breachable, defensible and difficult ground. So breachable and defensible, just like ruins. You can move through the items as if they weren't there, and defensible, +1 to hit with Overwatch, +1 to hit in the fight phase, one or the other if you charge into a unit. Difficult ground, however, -2 whenever you go through a wooded area, unless you have the fly keyword. That's charging as well, advancing as well, -2. And then dense cover, -1 to hit when you shoot. Dense cover needs to be at least 3 inches high. The -1 to hit doesn't apply to units within the wood But the -1 to hit does apply if you're firing through it or at units in it. Craters are the same as before, light cover and difficult ground. You get +1 to your armor save if you're shooting at a unit in it, and it's -2 whenever you're charging through it or moving through it. That one's easy. Then perhaps the last and most common item that we see, barricades and fuel pipes. These ones got very complicated. They're defensive lines, they're light cover, heavy cover, defensible, unstable position, difficult ground. Right, let's start with the easy ones. Unstable position, you can't stand on top of them. You can't stand on top of them, you can't do that anymore. And difficult ground, -2 if you're moving chart, unless you have the fly keyword, -2 to your movement. Defense line is easy because that's the same as 8th edition. You only need to be within 2 inches and touching the terrain feature to actually engage them in close combat. And defensible is the same as woods and ruins. We're going to see that one come up quite a lot, which means when you charge them, again, the +1 to hit on Overwatch, or they get +1 to hit in the fight phase. So very straightforward then. And then heavy cover, light cover. These guys get +1 to their armor save when you shoot them, and +1 to their armor save when you hit them in close combat. If you haven't charged and this is round 2 of the fight in the next turn, then both of these units here will get the benefit of heavy cover. Both of them will get +1 to their armor save as they battle each other over the top of the barricade. Okay, so it seems like a lot of changes. However, the heavy cover rule only really applies to barricades and fuel pipes. That's the +1 to your armor save in close combat. The dense cover rule, the -1 to hit something, only applies to woods, walls, ruined walls and industrial structure. And the obscuring terrain here only applies to ruins. That's according to Games Workshop with the examples they give. But again, they repeat that you can agree on these rules before the battle begins with your opponent. So you can choose to just play 40k as you did during 8th edition, or you can apply some of these rules bit by bit by bit on certain terrain features or build it up over time as you get used to 9th edition. What we're going to do here is trying to apply, I'll probably set up battle grids with only one type of cover on for a while so I can get used to that type of cover, and then apply it with and slowly build myself into it as we get into 9th edition. I'm sure competitive players out there and tournament players, it'll be in the rule pack exactly what they're doing and how they're doing it. But having a rules system where the terrain on the battlefield interacts more with the units on the battlefield, I think is a good thing. It means that terrain has more of a feature. It means movement warfare is more important than it was before. So those are the terrain rules. That's how they apply. I hope you enjoyed this video. Happy wargaming.